This story takes place a long time ago, before Duck ran on the line to Arlesborough. The line was a very different place then, as James will tell you. Well, on second thought, maybe he wouldn't. He probably wouldn't want to relive it. It was getting dark at the big station. The only thing illuminating the platforms was the orange glow of the swaying station lights. They reflected strikingly across James's glossy paintwork. But James was much too tired to notice how glamorous he looked. He was waiting for the signalman to change the points, so he could retire to the sheds for the evening. He was getting annoyed.
Come on. Don't tell me the signalman's gone to bed already. He gets enough rest during the day.
As James glared bitterly into the windows of the signal box across the yard, he began to hear the puff, wheeze, and clatter of an old, worn-out engine behind him. James was puzzled. Tidmouth Station's platforms all ended in buffers. How could someone enter the station from behind, he wondered. In a moment, he had his answer. The engine was Edward, and he trundled tiredly alongside him, pulling up to platform 5. This platform was so rarely used that James had forgotten it was a through line. Unlike the other 4, this track went out the back of the station and led up north to, somewhere. He was fuzzy on the details. Edward struggled to catch his breath. He was red in the face, and his quaint blue paint was smothered by black soot. James looked at him queerly.
Goodness, Edward, how heavy is this train of yours that you're this out of breath?
Edward just kept panting. He still didn't have the steam to respond, so James looked back at the train for himself. And when he did, he was confused. He stared for a long time, and then he laughed.
Just one coach? That little antique? You really are getting old, Eddie.
Edward frowned crossly. At last, he mustered the energy to speak. This train is much harder than you think, James. It took everything I had to get it here. Everything.
Then you need a trip to the works, old man. Really, this is so pathetic. I might even offer to cover your trains for a few days. Really, I feel that bad for you.
Edward rolled his eyes. He looked frustrated, as if James had misunderstood him somehow. But whatever the misunderstanding was, he didn't have the stamina to explain it now. So he just said nothing, and returned to catching his breath. James, however, piped on.
What is this, train, anyway? What good is a single coach? And nobody's getting out, from what I can see.
The Fat Controller calls it a token service. It runs up and down the branch line. In fact, it's the only train that does.
Branch line? What branch line?
The Northern Line. The one that ends at Arlesborough.
There's a branch line there? Since when?
Since always, James. But no one uses it these days. It's overgrown and badly cared for.
Uh-huh. Is that what makes the journey so difficult, then?
Edward paused for a moment. Then he seemed to agree. In a way, yes. The track is, disagreeable up there, shall we say. If the line were treated better, it'd be a fine place indeed.
Huh. No use in maintaining a line that no one uses anyway. Sir Topham Hatt should shut it down.
As James said this, the wind picked up. The station canopy above them shuddered and creaked. It even rocked a little, if only slightly. It can't be shut down, James. The government says that it is an important line. Sir Topham Hatt may run the railway, but he can't open and close whole branches at will. He needs permission for things that big.
But you can't just keep a line open with nothing running on it.
Indeed. But there is something running on it. Edward looked back toward the old-fashioned coach. She sat quietly behind him, balancing timidly on her 4 fragile iron springs. She wore an ornate color scheme, a deep green with a faded brown trim around the windows. She had to be over 100 years old, James thought. She almost looked like something the rocket would pull. Once a month, every month, she goes to Arlesborough, and back here again. And this single ritual is what keeps the branch line alive. James made a sour expression. He scoffed at what he perceived to be a ridiculous situation.
"That is the biggest waste of time I've ever heard of, Edward, and I once pulled a slow goods that went from dawn to dusk."
"I know it seems silly, James, but really, it is quite important. Branch lines must be shown respect. So long as a line is part of the network, it must run trains, even if it's only one. I will admit I dread the job, but it has to be done."
"I imagine. What's not to dread? A slow, boring track across a dead stretch of line."
The wind howled. The station roof shuddered once more. Edward furrowed his brow. "Oh no, that's not it, James. It's not the boredom of the job, it's the stamina it requires. It's such a demanding route. It takes everything out of you."
"It can't be that bad. You've only got one outdated old carriage behind you. You're practically light engine. And I don't care how bad the hills are, or the track is. I could do it in my sleep."
Edward scoffed knowingly. He eyed the vein red engine closely, and then averted his gaze to the ocean beyond the station. The moon flickered on the distant waves. The deep blue sky was almost as vast as James's ego. Edward simply replied, "No, you couldn't." And he smiled. It wasn't to cushion the blow, as Edward's smiles usually did. This one was different. This one was almost prideful. James was flabbergasted.
What? Of course I could."
"Trust me, James. You couldn't."
"I could. In fact, I will. When's the next train?"
"The 1st of February. A month from now."
"I'll take it then. You'll see. I'll run up and down the line in record time and return with stamina to spare."
Edward chuckled darkly. But then he actually thought about it. His smile vanished as he considered the proposition more seriously. Suddenly there appeared to be a great weight upon him, as if his dome had turned to lead. "Are you being genuine? You really want to give it a go?"
"Only to prove that I can. You can have your pointless little train back in March."
It is a serious responsibility, James. There will be severe consequences if you don't see the job through."
"It'll be a walk in the park, Edward. Of course I'll see it through."
Edward thought a while longer. At last, he let out a deep sigh. He seemed relieved, but there was another emotion on his brow, too. It almost looked like guilt. He shook it off and said, "Very well, James. I shall make the arrangements. I'll give you detailed instructions the night of your journey. It's imperative that you handle this job correctly." As Edward pulled away toward the carriage sheds, James yawned again. All of this seemed quite trivial to him.
Yeah, whatever you say, Edward. And when I come back, I'll give you instructions, too, on how to not get winded on a one-coach train."
James cackled for a while afterward. Edward just groaned as he trundled over the master switch and into the yard to tuck the poor old carriage into her shed for another month. James's laughter continued until the points ahead changed, and he was finally granted access to his nice, warm shed. He huffed proudly out of the platform, still chuckling softly as he slunk through the open doors and off to sleep. The month passed quite quickly for James. He was very eager, not so much to pull the dingy old coach down that abandoned stretch of line, but to show Edward up. But for Edward, the month seemed to pass much more slowly. His interactions with James were briefer than usual. He was almost solemn in nature. If James were a keener engine, he would have sensed shame in the old engine. But the arrangements were made either way. James was going up the Arlesborough branch. He was rostered on the token. At last the night came. The station master stood at platform 5, a hefty yawn coming over him. It was late. Not just the time of day, but the train, too. It was meant to leave at 9 o'clock sharp. But when James drifted into the station, it was nearly 10. His expression wasn't apologetic, in the slightest.
"All right, let's get this charade over with. Henry favors my berth in the sheds, and I don't want to give him the chance."
The station master was not so nonchalant.
You're nearly an hour late, James. I've known you to be tardy, but this is ridiculous.
Oh, I agree. It is ridiculous, but that's got nothing to do with me. Be honest, sir. Did anyone actually board the train in the last hour?
The station master shook his head, but his irritation was not lessened.
That's the point, James. You had a job to do, and you shirked it. You have no respect for the service.
Hey, I'm here, aren't I?
Yes, you are, when you should have been out there, on your way.
And with that, the guard's whistle blew, and James strutted lazily out of the station. The old wooden carriage was so small and light, James could barely feel her weight on his coupling. He rolled his eyes and smirked. James emerged from the back of the station. A cloud of golden steam erupted from the bright, warm light as he rode into the cold, blue night. He began to pass the huge roundabout behind the station. In the center stood a colossal statue. It was the first regent of Sodor, beloved by the people of Tidmouth. His stony gaze looked out across the town and over the Irish Sea. At that moment, James felt a chill. As he left the statue behind and disappeared from its field of view, he felt unprotected, as if no one was watching over him now. Tidmouth was behind him now, further and further. The stunning sea of city lights began to dwindle. The deeper into northern Sodor he ventured, the fewer signs of life there were. Terrace homes became single houses became cottages, and cottages became abandoned shacks. A few miles later, there were no buildings to be seen at all, and in fact, no lights beyond his own.
No wonder no one boards this train. No one lives out here.
But as he said so, a shaky, timid, but still somewhat confident voice creaked out from behind him. It was the coach. There are people further north, but the people in Arsborough neglect the railway. They've given up on this line. They take the bus now.
Huh. If the journey looks like this, I don't blame them.
Indeed, it wasn't a pretty sight. The trees and bushes along the line were overgrown. Fences that once separated railway from countryside were collapsing in on themselves, and worst of all was the track. The sleepers were laid at odd angles, and some were even rotting through. James normally thought that rails looked beautiful at night, the way that the moon reflected off of their silver surfaces. But these rails hadn't been silver in years. They were a corroded brown, almost a perverted red. It made it hard to see where James was going. He almost felt as if he wasn't standing on rails at all, but instead trailing over the coarse dirt of the barren fields. That brought back horrid memories. Memories that James suppressed.
Why even build this line, if we were just going to abandon it?
James paused for a few seconds, and then he cleared his throat crossly. Oh, are you talking to me?
Mm-hmm. So, what's the answer?
Well, the fat director never wanted to build this line.
Huh? Well, then why did he? He's the most stubborn man there is. Nobody could push him around.
The government could. They ordered this line for defense purposes.
Defense purposes? You mean this line was built for the First World War?
No, James. The whole railway was built for the First World War. James didn't respond. For a long time, his face fell. His usual snide expression disappeared, and in a rare display of authenticity, his face displayed his genuine emotions. He was truly surprised to hear this, and it seemed to upset him.
I never knew that.
That's why we connected up all the railways, so that goods and soldiers from all over Sodor could reach the mainland. A great many of those soldiers came from here. Arlesborough was a bigger town back then, but after the war it was never the same. The one thing keeping it alive was that little railway up north. But when that closed down, this branch line lost all purpose, all reason for being. James grew silent. He scanned his surroundings again, this time with new eyes. The poorly kept countryside was more than just ugly. It was sad, almost despairing. But his reverence did not last long. A long, thick tree branch smacked him square in the face.
Ouch! Ugh! Rotten, overgrown wasteland!
It's seen better days. No one cares to keep it up anymore.
Who could blame them? This place is more trees than track.
Another tree smacked James in the face. This one was so full of leaves it exploded like a tumbleweed and rained down all over James's boiler. He tried to curse the tree out, but his mouth was full of leaves.
That's it!
And he stopped dramatically.
I shall go no further. This is not worth my time.
But James, we're not even to the station yet.
Get a hold of yourself, coach! You're empty, for Christ's sake!
I have a name. It's Edith.
Okay, well then, Edith. This whole thing is a joke. I'll go back and tell Edward we finished the journey. It makes no difference.
But the passengers...
There are no passengers!
Edith paused for a strangely long time, as if she was deciding whether or not to say something. She didn't say it, whatever it was. The top station. There could be people on the return journey.
You said everyone is taking the bus.
Well, it's still a guaranteed stop.
Edith, dear, tell me honestly, when was the last time anyone boarded you? At either end of the line?
Edith's face fell. She looked sad, ashamed even. James felt guilty now. He hadn't considered her feelings. Passengers are everything to a coach. It must have been an embarrassing question. He opened his mouth to say something, to soften the blow maybe, but she responded, 27 years. And then she added, and 3 months.
I'm sorry to hear that. But it does prove my point, doesn't it? No one's waiting at Arlesborough, dear. Now, we can either brave this bushy, bumpy, broken railway, or we can go home and save ourselves the pain and inconvenience. I know what I'd choose.
I suppose I don't have a choice. You're the engine. You'll do it anyway.
Oh, don't be like that. I am asking, aren't I?
But as he said that, he began rolling backwards toward the station, undercutting his point. The decision had already been made. You can't do this, James. This train is important. More important than you realize.
Pah! You would say that. You are the train. Now relax. The Fat Controller will never know.
That's not the point, James. James!
What?
And he stopped again, simmering impatiently. We have to continue. We must go on.
Or what?
Or the branch will smite us. James blinked. He made a puzzled face for a while, and then, once again, he laughed.
Smite us?
As he said that, the sky opened up, and thunder cracked unforgivingly. A gale picked up and blew the muddy leaves scattered across the tracks straight into James's face.
That's it! We're leaving now!
James, please, heed my...
Oh, enough already! Count sleepers or something, will you? I swear. You're more anxious than Henry.
For good reason. But she said that last part to herself. James slept like a baby. No one suspected that he had lied about taking the token. Not even shrewd Edward could see through his deception. The way James figured it, he was hardly lying anyway. He had taken the token after all, just not very far. It was a lovely spring day. The air was sweet and crisp, and to make matters better, James was rostered on passengers all morning. As he glided slowly out of Tidmouth Station with his 9 large suburban carriages, he grinned broadly. He was relieved to be back in front of a higher class of coach. But as the day progressed, Edward watched James going about his work. He could see what a wonderful mood he was in, and that worried him. Any other day, Edward would have whistled cheerfully in return as James thundered through his station. But today, he could only let out a quiet, confused wheep. He chided himself for being so cynical, but he couldn't shake the thought that if James had really completed his run last night, he would not be in such high spirits today. Well, said Edward quietly to himself, I suppose we'll know soon enough, won't we? And they did. Later that day, as the sun was just beginning its descent in the sky, a few trains idled at the station platform. A couple engines from the other railway were waiting to depart at platforms 1 and 3, Percy shuffled trucks around cheerfully in the yard, humming some indiscernible tune. The clock tower clanged as 4 o'clock came and went. Henry simmered tiredly at platform 4 with the evening suburban, and right above him, the station canopy fell in. There was a tremendous crash. The thousands of little glass panes all shattered at the same time. The unbreakable steel that held it all together bent and bowed as it hit the platform. Passengers tuck and rolled out of the way. A few jumped onto the tracks. It was safer than standing where they were. Henry's pupils were pinpoints. His face had lost all color, and there was more glass in his tender than coal. The station canopy rested at a harsh angle, like a mighty guillotine blade hovering above Henry's boiler. But only hovering. By just a few inches, Henry had been spared. He had escaped injury, if not sudden death. At that moment, James sidled smugly into the yard with his return train. His run had been splendid, and you could see it on his face. But the second he rounded the bend and peered past the sheds, his jaw dropped. What happened here? James slammed on the brakes and stopped in the middle of the yard. Everyone else paused where they were too. For all their railway experience, no one was quite sure what to do. Henry locked eyes with James. He couldn't speak. He only wheezed desperately and tried not to faint from the fright. His quivering pupils seemed to say, "Help me." But James didn't know how. So he did what he always did in terrifying situations. He froze and did nothing. It seemed that the whole city of Tidmouth was breathless. But after what felt like minutes, a booming voice broke the silence.
"All trains, stay where you are. We are going to begin a mass evacuation."
While the passengers and staff alike had stood mesmerized by the disaster, trying to get their bearings, the fat controller had found a porter's trolley and a megaphone. The certainty in his voice broke the whole town's trance. The world began to turn again, slowly. People exited the station through the rear, using the remaining platforms. Porters helped fallen passengers off the tracks. It was a miracle that no one had been pinned under the falling roof. Seemingly by the grace of God, the worst injuries were a few glass cuts and broken arms. Once the station was empty enough, every engine that could move on its own dragged its empty train out from under the compromised roof. Unfortunately for Henry, he was not among them. His boiler might have cleared the canopy, but if he tried to move, his cab and coaches would scrape against it. And that was all it would take to bring the guillotine slicing down. His terror intensified, and still James sat there, paralyzed. Despite his horror, Henry finally found words.
"James, do something."
What? Like what? What good can I do?
"There's a crane in the yard. You know that."
And what am I meant to do with that? Jam it in there and raise the ceiling up? The whole thing could come down.
Just then, a horrible metal rending noise escaped from the slowly sinking station roof. With a quiet, horrible clink, the canopy came to rest on Henry's boiler. He wasn't bearing its weight, but with the canopy still sinking, it wasn't clear for how much longer. James could see metal pressing down on his friend. A few bolts gave way and his handrail broke free.
James, my train is empty. My crew is ready to move me. I just need a little clearance."
James stammered and stuttered helplessly.
In the yard, you said? Well,
Just then, Edward's whistle sounded sternly from the mouth of the yard. "Out of the way! Breakdown gang, coming through!" James didn't need to be told twice. He huffed quickly off the points, making room for Edward to swoop in. The terror in Henry's eyes lessened when he saw that faded blue coat come into view. My God! It's as bad as they said. Henry could only gaze into his eyes meekly. Despite the gravity of the situation, Edward cracked a small smile. "You can't ever catch a break, can you, Henry?" That made the green engine smirk, if only very faintly. Edward wasted no time in running around the cranes and pushing them into position. With the help of many seasoned men, Edward wedged the arm under the broken canopy and raised it very slowly and very slightly. Henry groaned with relief as the pressure came off his boiler cladding. At last, he could roll slowly out from under it. Once his cab was clear, he sighed deeply, followed by 7 small sighs from the coaches that had been trapped behind him. James watched the operation closely. He had never felt more relieved to see Edward, and that truly was saying something. But James also felt ashamed. A part of him had contempt for Edward, the hero, always playing the hero. James would have loved to be that sort of engine, but he wasn't brave. He wasn't selfless. In fact, if he was being totally honest, he might even describe himself as a...
No,
he thought.
I'm no such thing. I'm a good engine. A marvel, even. These are extreme circumstances. On the whole, I'm wonderful. Superb.
But then the station canopy smashed down, all the way down, just as the last coach cleared. Again, shame rushed into James's dome where the steam should have been. He had just been singing his own praises in his own head while watching a calamity play out in front of him. He had to wonder why he was like this. But he didn't linger on the thought. He couldn't linger. The station now looked very lopsided. It was much, much later when the engines could start winding down. There was a lot of cleanup required, and all the services on the western side of the island had to be halted. James's wheels were exhausted from pulling countless trains of rubble. He was looking forward to a nice, long rest. But he wouldn't be granted rest just yet. For just as he was nodding off, the old wooden doors slid open, and a dusty, tired blue tender backed into the berth beside him. Edward's state of exhaustion put James to shame yet again. But despite his looks, he wasn't ready for sleep. He had a few things to say first. The bulk of the mess has been cleared out. That western canopy is totally gone now. There's no roof, but we should be able to operate that way temporarily.
Ah, lovely. So I suppose we'll have the wind and rain to contend with now, huh?
You've seen plenty of wind and rain recently. I'm sure you're well accustomed.
Huh? I don't follow.
The branch line, James. The token.
Oh, yes, of course. Horrible weather down that line. Got leaves in the face, you know.
Yes, I've been there. But that's hardly the worst of it. Would you, like to talk about it? It must have been trying. Edward paused patiently. He was trying to give James the benefit of the doubt. Maybe, he thought desperately, his suspicions were wrong.
Oh, it was, uncomfortable, certainly, but a few bent rails and overgrown bushes are nothing to a mainline staple like myself.
Rails and bushes? Those are your only remarks?
Yes. Are we done here? Do I need to restate the importance of my beauty sleep?
James, you did take the token train yesterday, just as I instructed.
Of course I did, Edward. Of course.
Edward looked at James for a long time. James felt the old engine's knowing stare penetrate his very being. At last he looked away, but Edward did not. Do not lie to me, James. I told you, this train is no joke. It is a high priority.
It's a single coach with no passengers inside, Edward.
Are you sure there were no passengers, James, when you took it last night? James became more alert. This struck him as an odd question. How could he not be sure?
Well, yes, Edward, positive. Nobody got on at the platform.
I didn't say anything about passengers getting on. I asked if they were aboard.
What are you saying?
Edward lost patience. Damn it, James! You didn't take it, did you? You only said you did.
So what if I didn't? It's a nothing train on a nothing branch.
Both engines jumped. They darted their eyes across the sheds to see Henry, hurling through the shed doors and backing huffily into his berth.
Of all the piss-poor engineers I've met in my life, the ones who designed that station take the cake. I was nearly killed today.
Could you knock next time? You gave us a fright.
Good! You should be frightened. Any structure on this railway could collapse at any moment. The sheds! The sheds might be next.
But Edward interjected. Calmly, but still in a very grave tone, he said, "That won't happen, Henry. Don't worry. It's Platform 5 that was the trouble."
How can you be sure of that?
I inspected it myself, along with the workmen. We discovered the fault. As he said this, he shot an ice-cold look at James. "And we shall not let it happen again." Henry calmed slightly, and settled into his berth with a groan and a creak.
Oh, good. For a moment there, I thought the railway might be in crisis.
Oh, no more than usual, Henry. Now rest up. You've had a trying day.
You can say that twice.
And with that, the poor big engine trailed off to sleep. James was beginning to doze off too, but Edward snapped him back to reality. "We're not finished, James."
Oh, aren't we? I'd say this conversation has been just as pointless as that silly token.
It's not silly, James, and you must take it.
Oh, Edward, for the love of...
Now! James's eyes popped open in disbelief.
What? Now? It's midnight!
Yes, and the token is far overdue. We can't afford to wait any longer.
You're daft.
James, the disaster at the station today was your fault. If you had just taken the token to Arlesborough, like I told you, this wouldn't have...
My fault? It was a faulty beam, Edward.
On record, yes. But we just did a safety check last week. That very same beam was in fine condition then. But then, seemingly overnight, it corroded to nothing more than a rusty old pole. That isn't normal, James. It isn't natural. This is what happens when you disrespect the token. This is what happens when you deny the branch its train.
Deny it? You're acting like this branch wants things, Edward. It doesn't want anything, surely.
Edward only gave a cold, desperate sigh. He didn't want to confirm that outright, but his silence said it all. The Northern Line was not to be trifled with.
You're going senile, Edward. Don't bother me with your delusions. I'm going to bed.
James, listen to me. That train must go out.
Then you take it.
If I could, I would. But it's too late now. You promised to pull that train, and the branch will hold you to it. You've disrespected it, and it won't leave us be until you set things right. But James didn't respond. James, please, for once in your life, take me seriously. James! As the red engine's loud, nasally snoring filled the shed, Edward cursed under his breath. It was the first time he had cursed in years. Mother Mary! How does that engine sleep at night? The answer to Edward's question was, not well. As James drifted deeper and deeper into slumber, he began to have disturbing visions.
"You're disposable, James."
The voice echoed all around him. James tried to ignore it. He tried to bury it deep, down into his subconscious, beneath the soot and ashes at the bottom of his smoke box, the same way he had buried it all these years. But he couldn't do that, because this was his subconscious. In this realm, he had no power. In this realm, he had to do the hardest thing. He had to face himself, his real self. He was all in black. Soot and coal dust caked every inch of his body. His smoke was dark and musty, and his brass was duller than his worn-out wooden brake blocks. The layers that usually protected him had vanished. The several coats of wax and polish, the gleaming, resplendent red coat, and even the striking pink undercoat beneath it had all left him behind in the waking world. Everyone could see him for what he really was. No smoke and mirrors here. The voice repeated its searing remark.
You're disposable, James.
I am not.
You are
I'm not!
interchangeable, replaceable. That's our policy. The policy you were born into.
To hell with your policy, and to hell with your railway.
Come now. You don't mean that.
I do. Believe me, I do. And what's more, I've made a name for myself, a legacy. I'm admired, loved, respected now, so you can just stop following me around because I've outgrown you.
Disposable, James.
Stop.
You're disposable, James. Disposable, James. You're disposable,
Stop it.
James.
Stop it!
A shrill whistle sounded, and a guard's voice cut through the echoes. "All clear! On your way then, you three!"
No, I hate this part, no!
But James's protests fell on deaf ears. In a flash of filthy smoke, he was hitched to 2 other engines. They looked just like him, and that was no exaggeration. Apart from a single digit on their cabs, they were him. Behind them was a gargantuan goods train, which stretched far into the black void behind them, and out of sight. The engines were hitched so tightly to James's front and rear, his voice was muffled. He could only barely peer over the tender of the engine in front.
No! I want out!
"What's that, boys? The train's too heavy? Well, that's no problem. Throw more on!"
No!
James protested helplessly. He already felt trapped in the middle. But despite his muffled cries, 3 more engines backed down in front. James could feel the herd of locomotives struggling forward. He wasn't trying to pull the train like them. He was trying to get out. But there was no way. He was just one engine, encased in a consist of 6. And not only 6. "We need more motive power. These are too weak. Increase the horsepower." And sure enough, 4 more engines backed down on the front. And when they failed, another 5. And when all 11 engines couldn't move the train, an unbelievably long cavalcade of 10 more coupled in front. Together, they all suffered and struggled helplessly forward, spinning their wheels. James couldn't breathe. With each new addition to the train, poor James had grown smaller and smaller. No one could hear him. No one could see him. The train heaved slowly out of the void and into a barren countryside. Some children leaned on a fence by the side, watching the train crawl by at 2 miles per hour. As it did, a little girl called out.
Look, Bobby, it's James. That's me. Yes, hello there. It's me.
But she wasn't talking to James. She was talking to the engine in front. And then she looked confused.
Oh, is that James? Oh, James, is that you there?
None of these engines were him, and as she slowly made her way down the line, James's hopes grew. Eventually, she'd have to come upon the real James. "Is that you?"
Yes, it is.
But she couldn't hear his muffled voice over all the other engines snorting and rumbling. The tender in front of him made his speech nearly impossible. And when the next engine rolled by, the little girl asked again.
Are you James? No, it's not me. You had it right the last time, please. I want you to notice me. I want you to care. I want to matter.
He broke down in tears and sobbed with the beat of the endless train. It was hopeless. He was drowning in a sea of his own kind.
There's only one way, James.
James looked up, hopeful. The voice had returned. He was willing to listen to anything now.
What?
Only one way out of this misery.
Tell me!
I would, but you have a job to do, a part to play.
I don't want to play this part anymore!
And what of the other engines? They need your help. You have a duty to the rest of the railway.
The hell I do! I'm just one small engine in a crowd of thousands!
Small engine policy, James. Every drop in the bucket is vital.
Buckets aren't full of drops! It's all just bloody water! Those drops are gone the second they hit the surface!
Then you've only got one choice.
Give me the choice!
Break free. Leave it all behind. Follow your own track.
James gulped. He looked behind him. The train was endless, hundreds of thousands of wagons, maybe more. He looked in front of him. 21 engines, a truly staggering lineup. But nothing compared to the weight they were hauling. They needed all the help they could get. But that was their problem. James was drowning, a drop in the bucket, losing himself. So he broke the chain, and at that moment a switch emerged like magic, rising through the grass. Rails poked through the dirt like carrots, just in time for his weary wheels to roll over them. His rear coupling snapped too, and he shot forward, soaring ahead to freedom. It was only infinite blackness ahead, just a lonely, endless void. But it was so much better than being trapped in that cattle drive. He didn't dare look back. He heard whistles blasting desperately as the break in the train was noticed. He heard buffers smashing into each other, wagons coming off the tracks, brakes screwed hard on and regulators opened wide all at once, rending metal and breaking glass and shooting steam and dragging chains. He even heard a few boilers go. But he didn't look back. He couldn't look back. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his problem. He had to run away. He had to be more than a worthless mule, being prodded to an early grave. He couldn't fight the good fight anymore. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't my fault! The sheds were full. Gordon stood agape. Henry winced. Percy looked frightened himself. And Edward? Well, Edward did look deeply empathetic, but not at all surprised. James immediately became aware of everybody else's presence. All eyes were on him. He immediately looked back, and upon confirming that his boiler was a glistening red, he breathed a sigh of relief.
Bad dream, James?
Bootlaces. And he left the sheds without another word. It was much later on when James and Henry met again. They were both between trains and resting in the sidings of the goods yard. The odd-looking big station loomed over them. More of the sky was visible than usual. James had never realized what a big part of the station's appearance that canopy had been. Henry was staring too. They both knew that something strange was going on, but James was not eager to discuss it. Henry, however, was too much of a worrier not to dwell.
How does something like that happen? One moment, you trust the railway's architecture with your life, and the next, it comes down like a house of cards.
It's certainly unsettling. But hey, luckily no one was hurt, right?
Henry looked glum. Wasn't exactly true, but nobody was dead at least. His eyes darted across the station again.
I almost was.
Yeah, you almost were.
There was a brief but uncomfortable quiet. James mustered up courage and then spoke again.
I'm sorry, Henry. I should have done something. I don't know why I just froze. I suppose I don't know.
James kept rambling on, hoping that Henry would cut him off and tell him that it was okay. But he didn't. He kept his eyes fixed intently on the red engine, absorbing every word of his apology. He was holding him to it. James had been afraid of that. He considered getting angry or huffing off, but he knew that wasn't right.
I'm sorry, okay?
Henry paused thoughtfully.
Why didn't you intervene? I could have been crushed, James.
Yes, I know, but if I had gotten close...
You might have been crushed too. Is that it? You didn't want to risk your own metal?
No, don't make it sound like that.
It's what it is, James. Just be honest.
James didn't know what to say, so he changed the subject. Lucky that Edward was there.
Yes, thank God. I don't know what I would have done. It seems he always knows what needs to be done, even if it's difficult or frightening.
James raised an eyebrow to this. A terrible thought flicked through his mind.
Has he said anything to you? Anything, bizarre?
Like what?
Anything, I don't know, mystical? Supernatural?
Oh, don't do this to me, James. Don't be vague. You know I'm frightened enough of ghosts as it is.
I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying... I'm worried about the old man, that's all. He might be going senile.
If Edward is telling you that there are ghosts, there are ghosts.
Oh, shut up! How could you side with him so quickly? It's an absurd thing to believe.
Henry stood his ground and pondered his response. But as he considered his words, both engines heard Gordon's powerful whistle. He thundered around the bend and flew under the grand signal gantry at the yard mouth. He approached the master switch, ready to coast into Platform 1, as he'd done 1,000 times before.
Edward isn't an absurd engine, James. He's quite skeptical and thinks things through. If he believes in something, it's good enough for me.
God, forget I said anything. Am I the only one on this bloody island who doesn't believe in haunted branch lines? Utter nonsense, if you ask me.
At that moment, there came a great shuddering from the ground below them. The rails were quivering, and not just because of the express. With a dreadful screech that could pierce the ears, the points in front of Gordon changed. But it wasn't the signalman's doing, because the points changed against his controls. In fact, the control rod had snapped from sheer force, as if the rails had been pulled aside by a powerful magnetism. Gordon gasped and braked hard for a sharp turn he was not expecting. Then, another set of points broke free and changed direction. Then another, and another! In quick succession, 7 different switches snapped free and pointed in a new direction. When Henry and James followed the path with their eyes, they realized where Gordon was heading. Platform 5. Gordon, stop!
What do you think I'm trying to do?
Gordon gripped his wheels with as much force as he had. He was entering the wrong platform, and fast. As the coaches weaved through the yard at far too high a speed, some of them visibly oscillated back and forth. People held on for dear life inside. Gordon began to slow the surging train, but as he did, his brakes began to quiver just like the switches had, and with 6 horrible metallic clangs.
What happened? My brakes are gone!
He began to speed up again. Some unknowable force was holding Gordon's brakes open. The only thing stopping him now was his reverser. In a moment of desperation, Gordon threw it in reverse and spun his wheels backwards as he charged forwards. He shot out the back of the station, past the parking lot. Onlookers in the town square stopped to watch the enormous engine skid by, his wheels fighting his own momentum, his whistle hooting helplessly. Slowly but surely, Gordon was able to beat gravity. After a great deal of struggling, he finally came to a stop. But by the time he halted, he was all the way past the station, standing on the bridge at the edge of the town. The River Tid rushed below him, out into the sea. Gordon caught his breath and took stock of his own mortality. Henry and James were still in the yard, having watched the whole thing in disbelief.
We'd better go get him.
James agreed silently, and the 2 engines rushed to their friend's aid. Henry coupled onto the train and took it off of Gordon's buffers. He wanted to take the train to Platform 1, but the switches were all against him, with seemingly no way to shut them off. So the express was left with no choice but to park in the goods yard. The porters of the station rushed out in a mob, with every set of temporary steps they had, and they guided the passengers down to the dirty ballast of the shunting yard, around the back of the station, and into the roundabout. High above them, the first regent watched over the second evacuation effort this week. Luckily, no one was hurt. James wondered if that was because of the regent. As he gazed at the statue's face, he couldn't help but feel that the stone man had contempt in his eyes. Contempt for him. Once the train had been moved and emptied, James could reach Gordon. The wounded lion was taking deep, steadying breaths. James made sure to be careful approaching him. He kept Gordon's pride in mind.
My goodness. 40 miles an hour, no brakes, and you still managed to stop this train.
Gordon's deep breaths continued. At last, he mustered a deep-toned, short chuckle.
It was my duty, after all.
James stumbled back a little. There was that word again, duty. He was growing tired of hearing it.
I'll take you back to the sheds.
Don't bother, James. Take me to the works.
What? Is it that bad?
Gordon struggled to admit this next part, but he did.
My brakes aren't just jammed open, James. They've been pulled clean out.
All of them?
All 6. Each and every one. Don't ask me how, but my brake blocks are useless.
James shuddered. He knew exactly how that felt. But he didn't say so. He just hauled Gordon slowly backward. As they backed off the bridge, James watched the branch line retreat into the distance. He wanted to deny the obvious, but he couldn't. It was right in front of him, in the most literal sense. This infernal branch line had tried to claim his friend. It was desperate for a train. Any train. If it couldn't have the token, it would take the express in its stead.
Damn it, he muttered. I'm starting to think like Edward.
The River Tid roared below them. To James, it almost sounded like a pained screaming, like the branch was crying for mercy. He could almost hear words in the rapids, miserable, wretched words. It was dark when James came back from the works. The men had set to work fixing the switches. The fat controller oversaw the whole operation, shaking his head.
I suppose it could have been a spring failure, but this many points at once simply isn't possible. And yet, here we are.
As James approached the work zone, he was flagged down. He wasn't quite sure how to get to the sheds, or even if he could. Sir Topham Hatt sprinted over to him. The orange floodlights glaring down on them were the only source of illumination. It made Sir Topham's face look harsher than usual. He was carrying a shovel, which he promptly thrust into the dirt. He addressed his engine.
James, I've been meaning to speak to you. Henry tells me that the points just snapped out of place, all at the same time. Can you corroborate that?
Yes, sir. It just happened. Seemingly for no reason.
I see.
Sir Topham Hatt pondered for a long time. He stuck his hands in his pockets and looked out to the moonlit sea. He wasn't wearing his hat or his tails, only his gray undervest, now hopelessly dirtied with grease and sand. It had been a long day. He turned back to James.
Edward tells me that you took his token train the other night.
James's boiler ran cold. He wasn't sure what to say. It hadn't exactly been approved, but if he lied about something this big, it wouldn't be a white lie.
Yes, sir.
Edward did give you the rundown, didn't he? You ran the service to completion, as he intended.
Oh, well, of course, sir.
Because if you didn't, that would result in a great, deficit in our books, if you catch my meaning.
James puzzled for a while. The fat controller didn't usually speak in riddles. He had an unhealthy interest in puns, certainly, but he always spoke clearly and plainly. The fact that he was beating around the bush implied that he wasn't comfortable speaking to the full depth of the issue. James looked over the stout man's grease-stained shoulder. Within earshot stood a gang of workmen, wrenching tirelessly at the rails, but doubtless still listening.
Sir, Edward has some, interesting beliefs about this train. Are you aware?
Hatt just put his hands on his hips and shook his head at the ground, as if to say, yes, but I can't admit to it. But he didn't say that, because he couldn't admit to it.
Edward is my most reliable engine. He's always put the railway first,
and he's not been wrong before. So, if he's telling you to do something,
and then he met James's gaze with such intensity that James nearly dumped his fire,
then I suggest you listen to him.
Sir, that branch line is dreadful. It isn't even safe. The tracks are warped, and the...
But Hat was tired and at his wits' end. He would stand none of James's whining tonight, and he had no grace or tact left, only raw leadership. So, he ripped his shovel from the ground and swung it squarely into James's lip. It made a comical metal clang. It tickled James's lip, and more importantly, it shut him up.
Do you know what an act of God is, James?
No, sir,
murmured James, unintelligibly.
It's a natural disaster, something beyond the cause or responsibility of man. This,
and he gestured to the station yard, standing in ruin,
is an act of God. But the insurance company will not see it that way. They will blame me for the points, and the canopy, and passengers' hospital bills. It cannot keep up like this. We may not be living in the 20s anymore, but this railway is still fragile. We cannot afford another calamity. Now I'll ask you this once. Do you understand?
He pulled the shovel away. He knew how his engine would respond.
Yes, sir. I do, sir.
And then Sir Topham Hatt leaned in close enough that the workmen couldn't hear, and he whispered,
"Take the train. Now, so we can be done with this."
James said nothing more. He trundled to the goods yard to collect his coach. Edith was already awake when James came knocking. He braked to a halt before her.
"Do you ever sleep?"
"We're all due for eternal rest one day, James. I'll make up for it then."
"Ugh, you and Henry should share a shed."
And with that, he buffered up, and the two ventured out onto the Arlesborough branch line for the second time. As James approached the bridge, he couldn't help noticing that all the points were already set for him. "I assume the fat director had a word with you."
"That obvious, huh? And he's called the Fat Controller now. Show respect."
"I have nothing but respect for the man, though I'm surprised that you do."
"Why? I owe everything to him."
"Respect requires humility. I didn't know you had any."
"For the man who made me red?"
"I absolutely do." "That color really means everything to you, doesn't it?" James wanted to make a snarky reply, something like, "It would be to you too, if you were this glossy." But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath, and he chose his words carefully. For whatever reason, he felt like he could be honest with this coach. Maybe because she was so isolated from the rest that she would never gossip. But more likely, though he didn't realize it, it was because she reminded him of Edward.
"It's not really about the color."
Then what's it about?"
"The rebirth. I came here to reinvent myself, and the Fat Controller let me. He recognized my potential, and he dressed me to impress. He was the first person to ever see me as an individual. To him, I wasn't
disposable." James gulped. How did she know? He tried not to look startled.
Yes, something like that. He put my past out of mind and bet everything on my future. He forgave it all. My crash, my lowly position on the LMS. He didn't even blame me for...
James's mouth went dry. He couldn't bear to admit any more. "Blame you for what?"
Nothing at all. Speaking of nothing, when did we leave the city? Not a light in sight."
"We've already gotten further than last time. I am glad. You were so lost in thought. The broken sleepers and overgrown trees barely fazed you."
"Yes, I suppose so. Oh, goodness. Up ahead. Why's it gone so black? Are we entering a valley?"
"Ah, here comes the tunnel." Sure enough, James came to the gaping mouth of a dark tunnel. It was so long he couldn't see the other side. He slowed slightly upon approach. It was so dark he hadn't even been able to make out the facade.
James, don't slow down. Your journey is about to really begin. Be ready and be brave.
What? Oh, more cryptic talk, I swear. Edith, what's on the other side?
I wouldn't worry so much about the other side, if I were you.
James just whimpered. He grew closer and closer, and then took a deep breath as the darkness consumed him. Total blackness. James had to squint hard to make anything out, even with his headlamp on full blast. He felt very out of his element. The tunnel went on for some time, with no sign of an exit. James began to look closely at the tunnel walls. And then he noticed something. Were the walls moving? He knew it was just some kind of illusion, but it seemed as if the endless rows of bricks were pulsating, slowly expanding and contracting, moving in and out. All the while, the wind outside picked up and slowed down. The sound echoed through the tunnel. It sounded like breathing.
Edith, am I seeing things? Edith?
Edith said nothing. James looked back, but he couldn't see anything in this darkness. He couldn't feel if he was still pulling her or not. She was too light.
I want out of this tunnel, now!
And then, almost as if his wish had been granted, light began to appear in the distance. James was filled with relief.
Yes! Yes, 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 yes! Out! I want out!
The light grew brighter and brighter. James sped up.
Yes! Yes, yes, thank God! Daylight! I can see daylight! I can see... See...
James's boiler ran cold. He thought for a moment.
Daylight?
And that wasn't the only strange thing. As James exited the tunnel mouth, he found that it wasn't a conventional exit. The roof slowly opened up, but the tunnel walls remained. James could see the cloudy, overcast sky above him, but he couldn't see anything else. On either side were enormous dirt walls, dug crudely into the hillside. James felt like he was in a long grave.
No, not a grave. A trench.
A deafening boom sounded, and then the violent and ruthless clatter of several dozen machine guns. Cries from either side of the trench, exclamations, first in German, then in English. To James's absolute horror, he could see a furious storm of bullets flashing above him. If he could have ducked down, he would have. Quaking in his still spinning tires, he wondered if his funnel were visible. The bullets were flying just above it. He felt one graze his whistle.
No! I can't do this!
And so, in the middle of the ceaseless combat, James slammed on his brakes. He came to a cold halt in the middle of the chaos, ducking just below the trench walls, cowering like a petrified child. His eyes were shut tight.
I'm not built for this!
He whimpered for what felt like half an hour, but was likely no more than a minute. But in this situation, time hardly meant anything anyway. At last, James opened his eyes again. The bullets were still flying. He could see the long track ahead of him. The trench flattened out up there. He would be out in the open. He would see everything. The sounds of the slaughter were horrible enough. He couldn't bear to see it, too. But more than anything, he couldn't bear to put himself in the line of fire. He was safe here. And when he looked back, he realized he would be safer in the tunnel. It was still there, as deep and black and all-consuming as ever. He found his confidence again, and he charged backwards. "James, what are you doing?" He could see Edith again. She shook rapidly as he hurled her backward into the darkness.
Are you even paying attention? We've stumbled into a bloody war zone!
You made a promise, James. You swore your service to this branch. It's for the greater good. Your friends, your passengers, everyone will be in jeopardy if you defy your duty. James's speed dropped, just slightly. He felt an empty pit form in his firebox. A few lumps of coal toppled between his fire bars. He grimaced miserably. He even began to tear up. But even still, he pressed on.
To hell with my duty. I'm saving myself!
And with that, James disappeared into the claustrophobic blackness of the endless tunnel. When James awoke the next morning, he realized that he had fallen asleep. He was still in the darkness, but not the same darkness. He could see the bricks in the walls. They were stiff and rigid as Henry's tunnel. He could hear birds chirping outside, and upon looking back, he could see Edith, waiting patiently for him to come to. Edith always had bags under her eyes, and indeed, bags under her bags, but somehow it was apparent to James that she hadn't slept a wink last night, and not out of fear, but out of dread.
Did I fall asleep?
No, James. You passed out. If this branch line were busier, we might have been hit by another train in the night. James muttered under his breath.
Better than being hit by stray bullets.
What was that? James recovered and began to build steam.
We're going home. And if Edward hears anything about this, I'm burying you at the back of the carriage sheds. And I mean the very back.
You're a fool, James. Edward's not the authority here. There are greater powers at work than just one old steamer.
Enough! I won't hear that from you. I can't hear that.
And James picked up speed as he re-emerged into the morning sunlight. Before long, he was fast approaching the big station. The hustle and bustle of the city streets and the busy chatter of the workmen on the dockside gave him indescribable comfort. As James rumbled into Platform 5 backwards, all attention immediately fell on him. Henry was the first to speak.
James! Good heavens, you're all right!
Of course I am, Henry. Why wouldn't I be?
Well, it's just... when you didn't return home last night.
My journey to Arlesborough took a little longer than expected, that's all. I spent the night at the top station.
Just then, Gordon backed onto his train. His brakes made a very stiff, groaning noise. It would be some time before he broke them in. Doubtless, this made him very grouchy.
Spent the night on a 10-mile journey? Puh! That's not an overnight trip. Why, my siblings travel 400 miles without so much as a stop. Daily.
Edward sat darkly at the back of the station, listening to the dispute. At last, he rumbled slowly forward to join the others, just as James was justifying himself.
Oh, well, you've never been, Gordon. It's a dreadfully arduous bit of track. I had to shed at Arlesborough for the night, that's it.
At last, Edward broke in. Did you now?
I did. Even an engine as capable as I knows his limits.
Then why, might I ask, are you facing backward?
It was the only way back down.
Arlesborough has a turntable, James. An awkward silence fell over the engines. Gordon and Henry looked judgmentally at James, who blushed.
I must have missed it. All that overgrowth. I mean, I could barely see the track past all those bushes, let alone a table.
You're a liar. Everyone gasped. It was uncharacteristically bold of Edward to criticize anyone directly, let alone in such a harsh tone. James gritted his teeth.
What is this, the House of Lords? Stop with your judgment. I made the trip, and now I'm back again. So there.
But he couldn't sell it like he wanted. He raced out of the station and into the yard before Edward could even reply. That told the other engines everything they needed to know. Why this train was so important, Gordon and Henry didn't know, but they could see that James was faking it. And if Edward was being this blunt, it had to be serious. Gordon cleared his throat, and Henry chuckled awkwardly, and the two made their departure without another word. James returned Edith to her little wooden shed in the corner of the yard. He tried not to make eye contact. She looked like she wanted to cry and scream at him all at once. James went about his work and tried not to think about it. It was all passenger trains again, but he couldn't enjoy them. The reality of his situation, the railway's situation, was dawning on him. That evening, as the sun fell behind the waves and a golden light wrapped itself around everything, James found a siding close to the harbor and let off steam. He tried not to think about the night before. He focused on the gorgeous sunset flickering upon the ocean waves. Tidmouth's two colossal concrete jetties spanned off into the distance, as if they were trying to reach out to touch the sun itself. But the peace did not last. James felt the warm steam of another engine caress his buffers. It kept up until he finally acknowledged it.
You know, if you and I hadn't known each other so long, I'd think you're some sort of stalker engine. I'm getting quite tired of these rude meetings.
And you think I'm not? I don't like it either, James, but the fact is, you neglected your duty.
Would you stop saying that? I didn't dodge anything.
Did I say dodge?
Ugh, it's that word. Duty. I hate it.
Perhaps you'd hate it less if you actually lived up to what's expected of you.
I didn't know what this entailed. Nobody told me it would be so hard and horrid.
James, I warned you. I know you've got a talent for suppressing memories you don't like, but you must remember what I told you. James was silent for a few seconds. Then he glared at Edward with a sort of insulted confusion.
What the hell is that supposed to mean?
You tell me. You know better than I do.
Yes, I remember you struggling into Tidmouth with one coach and no breath left. But I thought you were just old and weak.
Oh, would you stop with that? You're 40 and I'm 56. We're both terribly old for steam engines, so grow up already.
Huh. Where's that classic Edward composure we're all so used to?
My patience is wearing thin, James. I don't have time for niceties. How can I make you realize what's at stake here?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe a small seance. Hell, let's make a day of it. Take a trip east and visit the bloody Standing Stones. Your ghosts can tell me all about the stakes for themselves.
Do not trivialize this, James. You were there all night. You must have seen something. You know that there's truth to what I'm telling you.
I know that I'm being punished, but I don't know what I did.
Perhaps the branch was trying to show you that, to make you confront it.
I mean by you, Edward. You're punishing me. You know what I think? I think that you're just fed up. You're sick of waiting for me at the washdown, and shunting my trucks, and coming to the rescue when I find myself on my side, for perfectly understandable reasons. I get on your nerves, just admit it.
I love you, James. You're my brother, in every way that matters. Now, this had been a very shocking week for James, but hearing that surprised him more than anything.
You do? I am?
That's quite all right. You haven't got to say it back. Gordon would never let you live it down. But it's important that you know that. No matter what, I always have your best interest at heart. Always. Except for the other night, when I let you take this bloody train. In that moment, I was selfish. I was just so sick of the terror, the torment, the misery of that line. I wanted a break. But I should have known better. I have a duty, and I should have bared it without complaint. I'm sorry, James.
Edward, I don't know what to say. I mean, well...
But he didn't have time to find the words, because as he was stammering and pontificating on the right response, he heard a terrible crack. The nearby dockside crane was leaning at a frightening angle, and not towards the harbor, but towards Edward. The old engine didn't hear or notice it. He was too steeped in his own regret. But James did. He watched as the supports gave way, and the crane started to fall in Edward's direction. James almost froze. He almost backed up. But somehow, some way, he didn't. He raced forward.
Edward, look out!
What? Oh, good heavens! James hurled himself into Edward and forced him out of the way. The siding came to an abrupt end, so Edward's tender smashed through the buffers and crunched into the ballast. James's tender barely cleared the crane's underframe, and not a moment later it thudded to the ground with a brutal iron bang! Both engines breathed heavily. Edward regained his famous composure, and with the driest wit, said, "My, that was bold of you." James looked back and forth between the crane and Edward. He could hardly believe what he'd done. Yes, it was. Thank you, James. I would have been a goner without you. With that one sentence, days of experiences and lessons came back to James all at once. Finally, he began to absorb everything he'd been told. And then, slowly and with the utmost seriousness, he muttered, "You were almost a goner with me. I did cause this. I caused that, too." And he looked toward the butchered station, now missing half of its roof and looking quite bleak. "I don't know how this works, but I know how I can stop it. I know that I have to stop it." Edward smiled. Relief flooded over his stress-wrinkled face. "Yes, you do. But it won't be easy. You'll have to do the hardest thing, and face your greatest fears." James frowned vulnerably. He was close enough to the dockside to see his reflection in the murky water. Edward got the sense that they were seeing two very different Jameses in that reflection. "And what if I don't like what I see?" "I'm sorry to say, you won't. That branch line has been withering away for years. Station shingles have cracked and faded, platforms crumbled, and hillsides eroded. It's reverted to its most natural form, its true self. If you'll entertain my theory, I think it wants to lay you just as bare. Force me to confront myself, the true me. Beneath the red, beneath the brass, beneath that winning smile." James showed a bit of that winning smile upon hearing that, but only a bit. Edward could see the fear growing in his eyes. They'd both accepted the supernatural overtones now, but Edward could see that it wasn't the threat of spirits that was scaring James. It was something much deeper and more personal. "Edward, beneath all of this, what even am I?" Edward smiled and pulled forward. He winced a little as his tender wheels found the rails again. He gently touched buffers with his dear friend. "You are passionate, you are bold, and you are single-minded, James. A vivid dreamer with the heart and keen eye of an artist, and, under the right circumstances, a generous, compassionate ally. There is no one like you anywhere. You are unique, indispensable, and irreplaceable." James had to fight back tears. He couldn't say anything to that. It meant too much. He didn't need to, anyway. It was more than obvious. Edward could read him like a book. Using what little space he had between Edward and the fallen crane, he found the points, and he headed for Edith's shed.
"Why has it always got to be at night?" he asked the old-fashioned coach as they hurried over the bridge.
"It's only fair, James. Hidden by darkness, buried in blackness. Your appearances mean nothing there. Only your soul." James shuddered. That was what he was afraid of. It wasn't long before they reached the tunnel. Even before he was inside, James heard the most horrible groans, as if he was about to enter the mouth of a beached whale. Still, he finally realized how important this really was. He raced into the tunnel. The whale choked on his smoke. James watched as the bricks flew by. He tried not to look too closely, but he was sure they'd come to life again. But that was the least of his worries. He was petrified of what he'd see when he exited the other end, and most of all, what might happen to him. The tunnel seemed to run even longer than last time. James had the horrible feeling that he wasn't going straight, that he was making turns. He even felt a set of points once. Was he even facing north anymore? He couldn't help but consider turning back, but he remembered Edward's words. He tried to make himself believe them.
I am passionate. I am bold. I am single-minded.
You are disposable.
No, I'm wide awake. No, you can't follow me here.
You're replaceable, James.
I am irreplaceable.
You're easily discarded. A cheap tool substituted at the first sign of trouble. Nobody will protect you. Nobody will find you worth saving. If you want to survive, you'll have to save yourself.
You're wrong.
You'll have to turn back.
I won't.
No one will care when you're gone.
Edward will care.
James's eyes were shut tight. No use in looking anyway. He turned his energy inward and thought deeply. He thought about Edward's kind words. And then he thought about Henry and how despite everything, he'd been so worried when he hadn't returned home.
And Henry cares.
He went back further in his memory. He reflected upon his first day on the island, how he sat in squalor in that field, shredded grass and cow pies caught in his scorched brakes. He remembered hearing footsteps through the torn-up underbrush, nice shoes on muddy ground, and at last, Topham Hatt came into view for the first time. He looked down at James, who felt pathetic and helpless, a failure and a fool. And despite the scowl on Hatt's face and the stress in his eyes, his first words to the strange engine were,
Are you all right?
Are you all right? The Fat Controller cares. I am valuable. I am worth saving. I am worth something beyond this bloody paint. And you can't make me think otherwise.
Can't I? You deceive yourself. There's a word for engines like you, James.
Then just bloody say it.
Coward!
The tunnel opened up. The sounds of war forced their way into earshot. James shot out of the tunnel and into the rugged, unforgiving trench. Bullets and grenades and even some cannon fire formed a fiery ceiling just above his dainty whistle. James saw the clearing ahead, the flat land where the trench would offer no protection, and where he'd come face to face with this war for the first time.
I know I've got to go on. I know that. But...
The brakes screeched on, and James skidded to a stop. He was much further this time. A few more feet, and he'd be out in the open. His funnel was already peeking over the wall.
Everything in me is telling me no. This will destroy me.
The war's over, James. It's been for decades. James was really relieved to have Edith's company again, but the fear still raced through his boiler tubes. This is a painful memory, a phantom. None of this can hurt you now. But James just gulped, and then mumbled miserably.
It didn't hurt me then.
Edith squinted, surprised. I beg your pardon. This branch line has decided to show you a battlefield. It's forcing you to relive your worst moment.
You're right. It is my worst moment.
But not in the way you think. James had never sounded more ashamed in his life. He couldn't be lower. James, how did you spend the First World War? The war that ruined this branch line. The war that cost so many boys in this region their lives. What was it like for you?
I can't.
You must be honest, James. The branch line demands honesty, a true reflection.
I won't.
You must. Please! Speak the truth!
I didn't serve! I burst a cylinder in the first week of the war, and I didn't leave the works until it was over. I just couldn't do it. While everyone else worked themselves to the frames with troop trains and munitions loads and all the other vital goods, I cowered in the very back corner of Horwit, in the darkness, and I waited for it all to stop. I wanted to help. I wanted to lessen the burden. But the heavy trains, the low maintenance, the work. I just couldn't do
do it! I didn't want to wear out, like the others. I didn't want to fall in the line of duty. I didn't want to be disposable. At that moment, the fierce winds swirling around them stopped. The roaring tides calmed again, and the gunfire ceased in totality. And James was left in silence, with nothing but his thoughts, his shame, and his bitter tears. Move forward, James, into the open, into the light. James managed a deep, shaky breath, and then rolled slowly forward, out of the trench. At last, he could see the battlefield. He could see the brutality, the loss of life. It must have been thousands of young men, all slain in the service of their country. James saw himself in every one of them. They suffered the fate that he hadn't dared to, perhaps in a different way, in a different place, but they were all victims of the same war, victims of their duty. They're all Sudrians, aren't they? Not just Sudrians. They were all Arlesborough boys. They called this part of the island their home, but they never made it back here. They died in another country, far from their families, far from everything they knew and loved. Heavens! I think it's time they came home. Don't you, James? If only. But it wasn't a fantasy, for as James looked around, he realized to his shock that the soldiers were slowly rising from the ground. As more and more came to their feet, they began to walk toward the coach. James could see their young faces as they passed him by. You were young too, James. Nobody can blame you for being terrified, especially on a railway that saw you as replaceable. You don't blame me? No, James, I don't. And neither does the branch. Then why put me through this? Why did it choose to show me this vision of all visions? This branch lost itself to war, James. A war you've repressed for over 30 years. You couldn't respect its trauma until you faced your own. I understand now. I get it. And he did. James looked back to watch the soldiers taking their seats. Amazingly, despite hundreds and hundreds of them having lined up, only a few dozen were still to board. Once the last boy entered, he waved appreciatively to James and shut the door tight. All right then. To Arlesborough. Steam welled in James's anxious boiler. He forced it into his cylinders with a will, and slowly his wheels ground forward. But to his surprise, the coach was heavier than before, and not just a little heavier. It was heavier than any train he'd pulled this week, and those were made up of 7 or 8 modern carriages. As he struggled and panted forward, he debated whether this train was even heavier than the express. It was almost impossible to get started, but he did. He had always pictured souls as light, fluffy things that just floated there, but in reality, their weight was unparalleled. James thumped past unkept foliage and crumbling railway facilities, old buildings reclaimed by nature, half-collapsed chimneys, and abandoned railway stock all adorned the side of the line. It was hard to know how far he was. Despite his earlier lies, he had never been to the top of this branch. Edith, are we getting close? Yes, James. It's not far now. Keep going. Too late to stop now. We have passengers aboard. Edith gave a respectful smile as the two crawled under a corroded signal gantry and into the yard of the top station. The platform was tired and faded, tumbling to pieces around the edges. The station windows had been broken and the building had been scavenged from, but the soldier boys didn't seem to mind. When James came to a halt at the platform at last, they all rushed out of the carriage with excitement, Hurrying through the station thoroughfare, at last they returned to the town of their birth. James's eyebrows perked up when he heard a thunderous noise. And actually, it was the only pleasant noise he'd heard on this line. It was cheering. And not just that of the boys, but of the mothers and fathers and siblings, families reunited in the life after, their cries so relieved and full of emotion that they nearly brought James to tears. He couldn't see any of it. The town wasn't visible from where he was sitting, and chillingly, James doubted he'd see anything anyway. But even then, his heart was warmed. He'd given great service. He had done his duty.
Edward has to do this every month?
Edith sighed. There are many more, James. The war claims so many, and each one must get home, one way or the other. One day, the token may finally rest in peace with its passengers, but for now, it must ride again. James was saddened by that realization, but he couldn't agree more. The journey back down the branch line was so different than coming up. James had found the turntable, and embarrassingly, there wasn't a single bush or branch blocking it. You couldn't miss it. How foolish he must have sounded to Edward, with that half-baked excuse he'd made. James couldn't help but feel he'd been very immature, not just throughout this ordeal, but for his whole life up until this point. He'd never faced something with this much severity. He'd always shrunk away from such challenges. But now he had. Now, he understood fully how Edward felt, and why he had been so worn out that night. It was getting dark at the big station. The station lights still swayed in the ocean breeze, and their glow still bathed the station in a comfortable orange. They didn't really reflect as strikingly across Edward's paintwork. It was too worn and sooty for that. He really was due for a repaint and an overhaul. James hadn't been all wrong when he called him old and weak, but he'd have to wait a little bit longer. The railway wasn't made of money, after all. Edward had no train, but he did have a good reason for being there. Slowly, the station had cleared out. Gordon had left with his evening train, and Henry had retired early for the night. But Edward stayed, and he would stay as long as he had to, until James came home. When the red engine's whistle sounded tiredly through the night air, Edward smiled broadly. He had made it, and he knew James had made it, because he pulled into the station facing forwards. "Well done, James! Very well done!" James was still panting. He couldn't respond right away, so he just smiled at Edward. When he finally caught his breath, he wheezed. "You were right." Edward grinned. He looked just a little bit smug. "About which thing?" "All of it. About the train, about the branch, and about me." "I appreciate you saying that. But I was wrong about one thing."
"Oh? And what's that?"
"I told you the other night that you could never handle this train like I can. And yet, here you are. You faced your greatest fears."
"It wasn't easy. Not at all."
James paused for a moment, and then looked empathetically at his friend.
"Is that what you have to do? Every time you take this train?"
Edward sighed knowingly. "I faced my deepest fears many years ago, James. Your fears can only harm you if you deny them. It gives them the edge. That branch line has no more surprises left for me. I've mastered it." James looked away sadly.
"I don't think I could ever do that, Edward. I don't think I could be totally honest with myself. I'd go mad. There are some things I just have to believe about myself."
"I know that, James. It's who you are. It's how you've survived in life. To tell you the truth, honesty isn't all it's cracked up to be. Honesty is painful. I wish I could turn a blind eye to parts of myself."
Uh-huh. Like your, advanced age?
Very funny.
Okay, but on a serious note, you don't think I'm getting crow's feet, do you?
You mean smile lines?
Whatever. Have I got them or not?
You want honesty?
Sure, I can handle a little.
You've had crow's feet for the last 20 years.
Well, this conversation is over. I've got to get some rest after all. But I'll see you tomorrow, Edward.
See you tomorrow, James. And well done.
Yeah.
So James began to huff away. But before he left earshot, he stopped again and looked back at Edward.
Oh, and,
Yes, James?
I love you too, Edward.
Edward smiled broadly. His old eyes twinkled with tenderness. Well then, that's one fear alleviated. James left Edith at the platform. He figured her and Edward had some catching up to do. As James rumbled off to the sheds, he thought back. It had been a very trying week. James had rarely taken the difficult path in his life. Even more rarely had he confronted his own inner demons. But he'd done so now, and he was proud of it. That being said, he didn't care to make a tradition of it. For you see, in a strange way, James is defined by his delusions. He remade himself from the ground up a long time ago, and that's the way he wants to stay. He's happy to be James the Red Engine, one of Sodor's finest passenger engines. But, very, very occasionally, he must remember where he came from. He has to revisit those painful memories because, much like a worn-down branch line, if he doesn't go there sometimes, it may just destroy him.